Our household is sort of in the process of empty nesting. I'm going to cry, and I've made it through one sentence. That's not good. Not a good way to start, Pam. With 2 young adult children in college and 2 teenagers at home, we're in transition. For many families, the pandemic put up unwelcome barriers to connection and community as families were not able to gather, whether near or far, and opportunities to strengthen relationships were halted. We will feel the ramifications of that for a long time. In our household, the pandemic ended up bringing the 6 of us all together very quickly and very intensely under one roof. And we had the opportunity to spend lots of time together at just the moment that we were expecting the reverse. So it has almost felt like whiplash to catapult back into the reality of very infrequent times that Mark and I and our 4 kids are all together. I celebrate when just the hours overlap now, which has become almost compressed from the weeks and months and years that the Cranebring 6 used to spend living life together. During one of our recent times, I noticed how clearly I recognized that this group of 6 are my people. We hear that phrase tossed around sometimes, and it probably means something different for each of us. But there's something comforting about knowing we belong, knowing we are part of something intimately familiar, knowing we are in a safe place that each person can truly be themselves. The best and worst is known and accepted and worked through and loved. I am thankful for this experience of family, and I know it is not the case for everyone and their own experiences with family. Having 4 children puts one in a unique demographic, and it's kind of fun to connect with other families of the same size. And so I have felt some special respect for and bond with Pam and Dave, also the parents of 4. The theme we chose for these last weeks of Pam's ministry before retirement is "These are a few of Pam's favorite things." Think Mary Poppins. No, I'm still not going to sing it. Some of Pam's favorite things, like the color turquoise and chocolate, make for challenging sermon topics with related scriptural texts. But I knew immediately that we needed to highlight family, because family is so obviously important to Pam. And as I've gotten to know a couple of their daughters over the years, particularly Meryl and Erin, and just in my observations of the family when they have all been present here at church, I've noticed a couple of things. 1, they are quite tall. I guess that's a pretty surface level observation. But along with that, each of their daughters has a graceful presence that comes from a beautiful blend of the best of Pam and Dave. 2, there is a special attitude of care and undivided attention that is present in all of their eyes and hearts when you have a conversation with them. I expect many of you have noticed this as well, and it is one of the giftings that Pam has shared so generously with our church family during her ministry as pastor. And there are probably other shared characteristics too, special traits that have been passed down genetically and environmentally through parenting and doing life together that will continue in creative and beautiful ways in the generations to come and have been present in the generations before. No doubt there have been trials and challenges in those generations as well. And of course, sometimes we recognize that there are traits within us that we may have been gifted by previous generations, which we appreciate a bit less than the others. And we have our own unique offerings that blend with these shared family characteristics. And all of that combines to make us very interesting and unique humans. And I think some of that is what Matthew's gospel is demonstrating in these verses from the very beginning of chapter 1, which I might add is not only the beginning of the gospel, but also the very beginning of the New Testament. Of course, the author of the gospel didn't know that, since these texts were compiled in the centuries after their writing. But it has become an important element in the transition from the Hebrew Bible to the New Testament. In the sermon description that I wrote this week for our social media and email posts about the service, I jokingly called this the most riveting text in the New Testament. But here's the thing, I'm not really joking. For as dry as it looks on the page and sounds when it's read out loud, I think there's a lot of really interesting stuff here. Genealogies are found in multiple places in the Bible. There are quite a few in the Hebrew Bible, like Genesis chapter 5, the very last few verses of the book of Ruth, and pages upon pages in 1 Chronicles, and more. There's even another genealogy of Jesus in Luke chapter 3, one that looks quite different from this one in Matthew 1. I think it's fair to say that it's been important for God's people to identify who they are and where they're from. Often when we describe our family tree, we start with ourselves. My parents are blah and blah. My parents are not blah. My parents are X and Y, and their parents are or were. But the presentation of the genealogy here in Matthew is interesting because instead of starting with the focus person, Jesus, it ends with Jesus. And in so doing, the genealogy does two jobs. It links Jesus back to these important people from the Hebrew Bible, but it also helps to define those Hebrew Bible characters and their stories by the ultimate endpoint as we understand it in Jesus Christ. Now, we have to be careful when thinking about it in this way, because we don't want to suggest that the Hebrew Bible texts do not stand on their own. These stories are critical to Jewish tradition in the past and today. We need to be aware that when Matthew activates these stories in the genealogy, it is with the intention of utilizing a Christian hermeneutic, a Christian lens. It's not just, here's where Jesus the rabbi came from, but here's where Jesus the Christ came from. So I think just carrying that awareness is important so that we don't override the Jewishness of this genealogy and the purposes of the stories that the genealogy invokes. For me, one of the special and unique aspects of this genealogy is that women are included. And just as an aside, the fact that two of us in pastoral ministry here as females is not normal, not to be overlooked. Not that we're the women in the Bible, but I am often surprised when I have students who visit who have never experienced a female preacher. And so the fact that there's women in this genealogy is significant. This was not often the case in patriarchal societies where men were the named generations. 5 women are identified in this genealogy: Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, the wife of Uriah, who is Bathsheba, and Mary. There have been multiple theories tossed around about why these particular women were included and why not others like Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel. Perhaps these specific women are named because they had irregular relationships that led to irregular births, according to some commentaries. And that might be preparing hearers for the scandal of a very irregular pregnancy for Mary that is to come in Matthew's verses that follow. Other commentators suggest that these women are linked because they all have Gentile ancestry, demonstrating an inclusivity in Jesus' genealogy that will become very visible in his life and ministry, as well as in the early community of disciples to follow, as described in the book of Acts. I think we can safely say this is not and was not intended to be a historically accurate account of Jesus' biological genealogy, at least in the way that we think of historically accurate today. Unlikely that this would line up as we might see it on Ancestry.com. The Gospels in general are a theological account, explaining who Jesus is and what he was all about. And so that's why I think it's important that the stories that this genealogy evokes and the story that it continues of Jesus as the son of Abraham, the son of David, the son of Mary and Joseph, the Messiah. Jesus is a product of a long line of men and women, kings that were good and bad, individuals who were Jewish and Gentile, characters in the story of Israel that were admirable and unsavory. It's sort of like that with all of our families, isn't it? We have stories that we like to tell, stories that we carry with pride. And then there's the hard stuff, the parts we don't want to talk about, the parts that reveal that our relationships are not perfect. We are not living a fairy tale. Real life is hard. So Matthew is most likely not attempting to record a biologically accurate family tree. And because there was no documentary film crew following Jesus around, what we have is this book of sacred stories, the writings of human who, I believe, were doing their very best to describe their witness to, their experience with Jesus' existence and ministry, or the stories they had heard of him. Jesus' life and teachings and death and resurrection and continuing spirit in the world. The story we still tell in various ways that we hear it in the Gospels demonstrates humanity continuing to try to understand what God did, sometimes prettying it up, making it comfortable, making it make sense. Family is important to us personally, and also to the Church of the Brethren tradition with which we connect. The Brethren have long used the language of sister and brother, as we heard in our opening hymn, and I also like to include the language of sibling as a reminder that gender is not binary, and some of our queer siblings may have difficulty identifying with just one gendered sibling term. Our family stories interweave and interplay in fascinating and sometimes frustrating ways. This is true for biblical families as we consider this genealogical story of Jesus. This is true for our families of origin, our families by blood and by love. And this is true for our life together as a congregation and a denomination as we attempt to respond and interact with one another as family. With each birth, with each marriage, with each new generation, something new is in process. Something new and sacred enters the world. Something new is created, and the whole story changes. And at the same time, pieces of the story of past generations, many of the qualities and characteristics of our mothers and fathers are preserved, sometimes due to genetics, sometimes to environment, and sometimes to shared experience. So yes, Pam and Dave and their daughters have shared characteristics that we can see and experience, but there's also the how of their family and so many other families that's important to note. The prioritization on spending quality time together, the joy and celebration of being in the presence of generations, respect that families have for one another, and the care that they provide to each other through laughter and tears. These are things that are also present here in our Elizabethtown church community too, whether you are physically here in this sanctuary or viewing from a different place or at a different time. One of our greatest strengths, I think, is the intergenerational nature of this family. The fact that in this room earlier, maybe not right now, but we certainly had people who, because the kids have gone to Kids Club, in this building we have people who range in age from 1 to 90s and everything in between. We have members of this unique family who were carried into this building decades ago as infants, who were dedicated here as babies or young children, who were married here, who have served in a multitude of ways in this congregation over a lifetime. And we have siblings who are just getting to know us, who might be here for the first time, or have just been visiting for a few weeks, or have been here for a few months or a few years. Maybe some are still trying to find their fit, who feel welcome but aren't yet sure how they belong. Like Matthew, I think our job is to extend the story, continue the narrative, highlight the generations in the past and the generations to come, and identify that we are a family. Sometimes we have to look back to look forward. In this Matthew genealogy, the author is encouraging the audience, I suggest, to look back. And in doing so, they notice that God was with each of those named people in interesting ways. God's presence connects this genealogy from beginning to end. And the earliest hearers and readers might have thought, wow, God was with them. Just a few verses later, as part of the infancy narrative, the Nativity, Matthew identifies that Jesus is born and named Emmanuel, which means God is with us. Matthew suggests it is in the genealogy and then names it with the birth of Jesus. God is with us. For the earliest readers and for us today, God was with them and God is continuing with us. That is a powerful promise. There's one last interesting thing about this genealogy in Matthew that I want to share, and I had actually forgotten about it until I was in the middle of writing this sermon. At the very end, Matthew indicates that each of these groupings are generations of 14. The 14 probably has significance for several reasons, which I won't go into, but Matthew clearly states that there are 14 generations from Abraham to David, and 14 from David to the Babylonian exile, and 14 from the exile to Jesus. Except, if you count the generations in the last segment, there's only 13 names. Did Matthew miss the day they taught counting in elementary school? Probably not. Some scholars suggest that Matthew was bound to some prior source and needed to stay authentic. Others suggest that Joseph and Mary might be considered two separate generations. Perhaps there was a missed generation in one of the previous sections that was unnamed but counted. Or perhaps the suggestion is that the story continues. Maybe the 14th generation is to claim both Jesus and Christ as the identity of who was born. And if we understand the message from Easter a week ago to mean that Jesus continues to live in us, well, maybe we are part of that 14th generation. We heard Eddie Keith share this in his role as Jesus during the drama last Sunday. At the very end of the Gospel of Matthew, in chapter 28, the resurrected and risen Jesus tells the disciples to spread the word, share the good news and love of Jesus with everyone. And perhaps that is how the 14th generation is activated. The fulfillment of love and life through the family of God. May it be so.